Welcome to Muffin Talk.
Kia ora and welcome to Muffin Talk. This program is brought to you by the initiative Titipounamu Study and Joy. My guest today is Professor Peter Lineham. Hi to our radio program, Peter.
It's nice to talk to you.
Dr. Peter Lineham is Professor Emeritus of History at Massey University in Auckland. He is a specialist in the religious history of New Zealand and noted for his many articles, books, guest lectures, and his media presence. In 2019, he was made a member of the Order of New Zealand for services to religious history and the community. Peter, almost exactly 1 year ago, we talked about the 2023 census in New Zealand and the question of how secular Aotearoa New Zealand was. The census was held 2 years ago and the statistics have recently come out. Why did it take so long for this data to be published?
The simple fact is that there was a tremendous struggle in both 2018 and in 2023 to actually get results from all New Zealanders. And indeed, it has been announced this very day that we're recording, that there's going to be no future census, which is a tremendous tragedy in point of view of collecting religious statistics anyway. And so back in 2013, there'd been a very significant proportion of the population that hadn't answered the census. And so in 2018, they began to fill in the answers for people who hadn't responded to the census. And that's continued in 2023. And it's very significant for the religion figures because they claim, the census authorities, the Department of Statistics, by their hard work, to have filled in the religion of all New Zealanders, not a single person where there's any doubt as to what their religion is. I'm frankly skeptical that they could possibly do that. They're using such things as hospital records and possibly other data, but hospital records are the obvious ones where religion is asked for. And then they've used figures from previous censuses and imputed them to people, ignoring the fact that people do change religions at various times. Anyway, that's why it took so long. And that means that the data is a little bit suspect, but nevertheless, the very best we've got. And so we're grateful for what we get, even though with some groups, particularly groups with very strong Māori or Pacifica representation, where there tended to be low levels of reporting of the census, the figures are probably a bit skewed. And so over certain denominations and religions, I have some big question marks about the reliability of the data.
So that's very interesting that there will be no more census. But looking back at the census before 2023, the figure of New Zealand residents being affiliated with a religion had reached just about the 50% mark, which means that more than half of the population or the people participating in this survey were actually religious in some kind or the other. I understand that this mark has now decreased below the 50% mark. Can you tell us more about this?
Yes, so there has been a profound drop, really since about 1900, actually. It's been a long, slow process of the decline of people saying that their adherence to a Christian religious affiliation of various kinds. In recent years, this has dramatically increased, particularly since 1986, when they first had a tick box. You could have say, I have no religious adherence. And so finally in 2023 census, we reached a tipping point where significantly over half of the population, roughly 52%, 53%, said that they had no religion. And the share that claimed some kind of Christian affiliation very significantly dropped from 37% in
18.
2018 to 32% in 2023. So Christians now represent less than a third of the total population. So that's a very, very significant change. And it tells us not just of the growth of other religions, and it's true that really is a very striking element of the trends in New Zealand, but it is also the trend of disaffiliation. Both young people who grow up with no religious affiliation and people who abandon religious affiliation later in life. And I mean, that to me is the biggest trend, is disaffiliation from a religious connection, which they may have had in childhood.
What does it mean for New Zealand, for the country?
Oh, I think it has some very significant effects, and it has some very significant effects for churches. For the country, it means that we can't draw on a common moral or ethical or religious base as a reason for people to behave in certain ways. And in a very real sense, New Zealand is quite strikingly on the edge, along with the Scandinavian countries, of a very secular outlook being the standard approach.
But that means you have to get the morals from somewhere else, from another kind of codex.
Uh, well, there's pretty clear evidence that people are getting their morals on highly individual bases. Mostly, what's good for me, or some kind of, well, uh, you know, are the results good for everybody? So that kind of ethical principle, utilitarianism, we call it. Yeah.
And I understand that the Catholic community is still the strongest religious group, and the Christian communities in total are percentage-wise still the majority among the diverse religions. Is this correct?
Yeah, so let me just talk you through that.
Yeah.
So it is actually very recently, back in the 2013 census, that Catholic went above Anglican as the largest religious group. What we've seen, the most striking trend among the Christian groups, apart from the fact that all have declined except for the sectarian groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses, all of them have gone down. Within that, the largest drop is from Anglicans, Methodists, and Presbyterians, the so-called mainstream Protestant groups. They have strikingly declined. Now, Catholics have not declined to the same extent, but there's been a very significant decline between 2013 and 2023, and in the between 2018 and 23. Catholics dropped from roughly 10% of the population to roughly 9% of the population. That's a 10% drop in the total adherence. That's very significant. And when you go and look more closely into those figures, what is very apparent is that Catholic figures now are being propped up almost entirely by people from other countries and other ethnicities than European. And that without that assistance, the Catholic decline wouldn't have been quite as great as the Anglican and Presbyterian decline, but it would have been significant.
So you mentioned the migrants. For the migrants, religion is often more than a belief system. It gives a sense of belonging and community. And there has been a diversity of religions in Aotearoa New Zealand ever since the 18th century, or maybe even before. Are there any studies that show how strong the affiliations to a certain religion is after a few generations when they can't be called migrants anymore, when they're children or grandchildren of migrants?
Yes, there's quite a lot of studies that show that as a group becomes more at home in New Zealand, and that they need less the support of religion. And so, for example, among Pacifica peoples, from the 1960s, when they came in large numbers to New Zealand, to the 1990s, the proportion of New Zealand Pacifica who said they were religious or Christian or one form or another was way, way up there, far above the European figures at roughly 95%. The last two censuses, there's been a striking decline in that affiliation of Pacific Islanders. It's still the most religious people in New Zealand are Pacifica peoples, but that proportion has dropped down to about three-quarters of Pacifica, and the other quarter are following the general trend of rejecting religion, and almost certainly that is a result of their disconnection from their home religious communities.
And that's a really interesting point. And the exploring of the ethnic makeup and the religiousness of people born in New Zealand versus other ethnicities and born elsewhere.
And let me just give you an example of this for Catholics. You see, supposing, looking at the gross figures of Catholics, we have a figure that they've given us this year of the average age of each denomination. And the average age for Catholics is incredibly low compared to that of Anglicans, say. So the average age for Catholics is 44 years. The average age for all New Zealanders is 38, by the way. And whereas the average age for Anglicans is 65. That's how aged they are as a community. But if you go into the figures, and I've just been trying to collect these figures for you right now, and I'm looking across at median age for Catholics in 2018. Now, here we are. So the average age, it's interesting that those that have come from Europe or old are much, much older than those who have come from Asia. The average age of Asian Catholics is 38. So exactly along the norm of the total population. But the average age of those from the Pacific Islands is heading up into the 50, nearly at 50. And the average age from New Zealand, I tried to get the ethnicity. Unfortunately, those figures are not available at the moment. But I'm pretty sure what they will show is that Catholics born in New Zealand and of Pākehā descent are now becoming the aged part of the church. That the life of the church has to be drawn from people of different backgrounds.
And just quickly before we finish the interview, but I'd like to know which one is the religion that is the most increasing. I think last time it was the Hindu community. Is that correct?
And it is still the Hindu community, despite grand aspirations of Islam to grow. That's the really striking, strong community with the large proportion of Indian migrants in this country. For Catholics, of course, it's largely Filipino.
And Indians, I think so also.
Yes, Filipinos and Indians also are significant. The thing that strikes me about all of these figures, Beata, is that the understand for churches and for all religious communities, the challenge is how is faith talked about and expressed in this kind of landscape that we live in? It's very challenging.
It's a lot of food for thought, and I think that it's really important to look at these statistics and to remember what country we are living in, and especially as you mentioned with the moral rules that used to be given by faith communities. We have to make sure that there is this consensus in this country.
Indeed, indeed. And you can sense in many religious communities, say of migrants, deep anxiety for their children. And I think here education and community building are so, so important.
Yes. Thank you so much, Peter. It's been really important, and I hope that we can work on this. The Auckland Interfaith Council is definitely working in working together among the religions because we have so much more in common than with people who might not have any belief. So that's so we are in a way a big community of different faiths. Thank you very much.
A pleasure.
Aotearoa peace is calling, in the bonds of love we meet, for the world a new day dawning and shine.